A woman has just moved in and is suspicious of her neighbor's strange behavior and decides to install a hidden camera to monitor the hallway. When she looks at the camera, she can't believe what she sees. Lana McCarthy was never one to be intimidated by changes. At 29, she decided it was time to turn the page and seek a new beginning. After the end of a long relationship and leaving a job that consumed her, Lana found herself looking for something different, something that would restore peace and control over her life. So when she found that small apartment in an apparently calm and tree-lined neighborhood, she felt she had finally found the refuge she so desired. The decision was quick, and in less than a week, she was packed and ready to write this new chapter. The apartment was cozy, with walls in soft shades of beige, which perfectly contrasted with the dark wood floor. The large windows let in an abundance of natural light, creating a light and serene atmosphere, something Lana hadn't seen in a long time. Upon entering, she allowed herself a rare moment of contemplation. The move itself was smooth, without major hiccups. Few pieces of furniture, just the essentials. Lana wanted to start light, without the weight of the past. A comfortable sofa, a dining table for two, and empty shelves that she planned to fill with new books, memories of future travels, and perhaps a few plants. After finishing the organization, the space was already starting to have her touch. Simple, but with personality traits that reflected who she was. An independent, determined woman, but still searching for something deeper, something she might not even know how to name. The day after the move, the first person Lana met was Mrs. Henderson, a friendly elderly woman with gray hair who lived on the ground floor. The old lady, with her warm smile and curious eyes, offered an apple pie as a welcome gift, a simple gesture that touched Lana more than she expected. They chatted for a few minutes in the hallway, and Lana learned that Mrs. Henderson had lived there for over 30 years and knew every corner of the building, as well as all its residents. "You'll like it here, dear," she said with a welcoming smile. "It's a peaceful place, perfect for those seeking peace." The neighborhood also seemed welcoming. That morning, Lana decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, exploring the tree-lined streets and the small shops that seemed to have come from a simpler time. The old facades, the cafes with outdoor tables, and the friendly smiles of the few passers-by who crossed her path made her feel at home. On that walk, Lana realized she had made the right choice. She could envision a life there, away from the chaos of the big city, where she could find the balance she was so looking for. Returning to the apartment, already beginning to feel part of the place, Lana settled on the sofa, savoring a slice of Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. As she tasted each piece, she thought about how things were falling into place, as if the universe was finally conspiring in her favor. The silence of the apartment was comforting, a welcome pause in her always so hectic life. She smiled to herself, letting the fatigue of the past weeks dissolve in that moment of pure tranquility. In the first few days in her new home, Lana allowed herself to observe every detail around her, absorbing the small peculiarities of the building and its residents. There was something comforting in the quiet routine of that place, but also something that aroused her curiosity, especially when it came to the man who lived upstairs. Little was known about him, but everyone seemed to respect his privacy, as if he were a distant and inaccessible figure. Whenever Lana passed through the hallway, her eyes were automatically drawn to the dark and imposing door of apartment 3B. It was only a few days after the move that she saw him for the first time. Mr. Thompson, as she later learned he was called, was a tall man with a rigid posture and a deeply reserved look. He had a presence that couldn't be ignored, as if the air around him was always a little denser. His gray hair, always impeccably combed, and his dark and elegant clothes suggested someone who valued discipline and order. But what caught Lana's attention the most was the expression on his face, a mix of fatigue and melancholy that she couldn't fully understand. Lana tried to be friendly, giving him a slight smile when their eyes met in the hallway, but Mr. Thompson only nodded politely, without showing any emotion, before going on his way in silence. That brief interaction left Lana intrigued. There was something in the eyes of that man that suggested an untold story, a past that he seemed to carry with sorrow, the kind of thing that an ordinary person might not notice, but Lana, always sensitive to others' emotions, caught immediately. As the days passed, Lana noticed Mr. Thompson at various times, but always alone. He would descend the stairs with firm steps, holding a small leather briefcase, and disappear into the street without looking back. No visitors, no visible correspondence, just him, coming and going, almost like a shadow moving through the building without really being part of it. The absence of any trace of social or family life made Lana wonder about the life he led. Who was really that man who seemed to avoid any kind of connection? One late afternoon, Lana saw him again, this time leaving the building. She was returning from a walk, and their eyes met briefly once more. This time, Mr. Thompson seemed even more distant, as if he were immersed in thoughts that pulled him away from the world around him. He didn't seem to really see her, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he were fighting against something only he knew. The unease that Lana felt was immediate. It was not just the natural reserve of a lonely man. There was something more, something that left her with a strange feeling, as if she were on the verge of discovering something important. She didn't know why, but that man aroused in her a curiosity mixed with a slight unease. It was as if, with each encounter, Lana felt that there was much more behind that serious and controlled facade. One morning, while Lana was having her coffee in the kitchen, she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, she peeked through the ajar door and saw Mr. Thompson climbing the stairs. He was carrying a small wooden box, holding it carefully, as if it were something of extreme value. Lana couldn't see what was inside, but the expression on his face, a mix of concentration and tension, left her intrigued. What could be so important to a man who seemed to care about almost nothing around him? There was a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore, a feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And despite having no proof, Lana knew that Mr. Thompson was at the center of that feeling. Something about him made her uneasy, and she felt she needed to find out what it was. That night, the silence of Lana's apartment was almost absolute. She was already accustomed to the tranquility that enveloped the building, especially during the early morning hours, when the city's sounds outside became a distant murmur. But suddenly, this silence was broken by something strange, something that made her eyes open immediately. A distinct sound of heavy footsteps came from above, as if someone were walking back and forth restlessly in Mr. Thompson's apartment. That unexpected sound made her sit up in bed, her heart racing, as she tried to understand what could be happening. The footsteps continued, rhythmic and strong, echoing through the ceiling as if a restless presence was moving without a defined direction. Lana looked at the clock by the bed. It was past 3 in the morning. Who, in their right mind, would be walking like that in the middle of the night? Unable to go back to sleep, Lana got up and went to the living room, where the sound of footsteps seemed even closer. Sitting on the sofa, she tried to focus her attention on something else, but the noises from above were persistent, as if something, or someone, was disturbed. Whatever was happening in that apartment was not normal. There was an intensity in the movements, as if Mr. Thompson was dealing with something that required all his attention and strength. But what? The question began to hammer in Lana's mind, bringing with it a growing sense of discomfort. After a few minutes, the footsteps were accompanied by another sound, a heavy dragging, as if something was being moved with difficulty. Lana frowned, increasingly perplexed. What could be dragged in the middle of the night? The image of Mr. Thompson, always so quiet and reserved, now seemed strangely sinister in her mind. The sound continued for a few more minutes, before abruptly stopping, plunging the apartment back into an unsettling silence. Whatever had happened up there seemed to be over, at least for now. Unable to ignore her growing curiosity, Lana went to the window and looked at the building next door, where the lights in the other apartments were off, except for one, Mr. Thompson's. The faint yellowish light escaped through a crack in the curtain, partially illuminating the deserted street. She stood there, watching for a few minutes, but nothing moved. The quiet that had returned was almost oppressive, but the sound of the footsteps and the heavy dragging still echoed in her mind, like a persistent memory that didn't want to fade away. Back on the sofa, Lana tried to rationalize what she had just heard. Maybe Mr. Thompson was just rearranging furniture, or maybe he had an unusual night hobby. But none of these explanations seemed satisfactory. Whatever he was doing, it didn't seem trivial. There was a tension in those sounds, something that made her feel an inexplicable anxiety. as if she were about to discover something that would change everything. Lana spent the rest of the night in an uneasy vigil, her thoughts focused on the apartment above. She knew she should simply ignore it, move on with her life, but something prevented her from letting the matter go. There was a mystery there, something that begged to be uncovered, and she couldn't help but be drawn to it. When the sun finally began to rise, Lana got up, exhausted, but still unable to shake off the discomfort that had accompanied her since the first sounds. The footsteps, the dragging, the tension in the air. Everything seemed to be etched in her mind. With each passing day, Lana found herself more and more engulfed by the mystery surrounding Mr. Thompson. The nights became long, not due to insomnia, but because of the incessant questions that hammered in her mind. During the day, Lana began to observe Mr. Thompson with even more attention, though discreetly. She began to notice that he avoided eye contact with anyone who crossed his path. The man descended the stairs always at the same time, his eyes fixed ahead, never deviating. When he passed by Lana, a cold silence seemed to hang between them, an invisible barrier that he was clearly not willing to break. This only increased the feeling that something was not right. Each encounter, no matter how brief, heightened Lana's suspicions. She noticed that, unlike all the other residents of the building, Mr. Thompson never seemed relaxed, never showed a smile, not even one of those polite greetings exchanged out of pure formality. Instead, there was a constant tension in his body, as if he were always prepared for something. But for what? Lana's mind spun with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. One afternoon, returning from the supermarket, Lana had the chance to see something that left her even more intrigued. Mr. Thompson was in the hallway, standing in front of his apartment door, with a key in hand that he hesitated to use. His shoulders were tense, and for a brief moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if fighting an internal battle. Lana was paralyzed seeing him in that state. A man usually so controlled now showing signs of vulnerability, but as soon as he noticed her presence, he returned to his usual reserved state, quickly disappearing inside. Lana's suspicions grew even more when, during a casual conversation with Mrs. Henderson, she discovered that Mr. Thompson had lived in that building for years, but no one really knew him. "He's always been like this, closed in his own world," said the elderly woman, with a slight tone of mystery in her voice. "He never caused any trouble, but he also never made friends with anyone. A real enigma, if you ask me." Lana listened attentively, trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed to get more complicated by the day. As the days went by, Mr. Thompson's behavior became almost an obsession for Lana. Every movement he made, every sound coming from his apartment was analyzed, dissected in her mind. She began to take small notes, recording times, patterns, and anything that might help her understand what was happening. With each new note, Lana's suspicions deepened. Mr. Thompson was not just a reserved man. There was something more, something she couldn't reach, but that was dangerously close to being revealed. One night, Lana decided to stay up late, determined to listen to the sounds from upstairs with more attention. Sitting on her sofa, with the lights off and a cup of tea in her hands, she waited. The hours passed slowly, and for a moment she thought that perhaps she was exaggerating, that it was all just a combination of coincidences and her own imagination. But then, right in the middle of the night, the footsteps started again. This time, they were faster, almost desperate. Lana's breath caught in her throat as she listened intently, each step a new reminder that something was deeply wrong. As the footsteps echoed above her head, Lana knew she could no longer ignore what was happening. The suspicions that had started as simple curiosity now turned into an urgent need to discover the truth. Lana's restlessness had reached a point of no return. The sleepless nights, the disturbing sounds, and the constant doubts were starting to affect her daily life. She knew she needed to do something to dispel the growing paranoia that was taking over her mind. Determined to solve the mystery once and for all, Lana devised a plan that required caution and precision. She would install a hidden camera in the hallway. The idea seemed simple, but the execution required meticulous attention to detail. Lana spent days researching the right type of camera, something discreet enough not to be noticed, but effective in capturing any movement in the hallway. Finally, she found what she was looking for: a small camera with a high-resolution lens, camouflaged inside a fake smoke detector. It was perfect for the job. That night, Lana ordered the device, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and excitement. In a few days, she would have the answers she so desired. When the package arrived, Lana opened it with trembling hands. The device was small, almost insignificant at first glance, but carried the promise of revealing what the eyes couldn't see. She spent hours studying the manual, testing the settings, and making sure she knew exactly how to handle it. Finally, when she felt ready, she waited until nightfall and the building fell silent. It would be the perfect time to install the camera without drawing anyone's attention, especially Mr. Thompson's. In the early hours of the morning, moving with the lightness of a shadow, Lana left her apartment and headed to the strategic point she had chosen for the installation. The hallway was bathed in a tranquil dimness, but Lana's heart was racing. Every noise seemed amplified, every creak in the floor a reminder of the invisible presence of the residents around. She worked quickly, fixing the camera in the chosen spot, a high point, where it had a clear view of Mr. Thompson's door and any movement that might occur during the night. After finishing, Lana took a step back and assessed her work. The smoke detector looked harmless, exactly like any other that could be found in any hallway of a building. Satisfied, she returned to her apartment, trying to calm her nerves as she turned on the monitor that would receive the images. The feeling of getting involved in something potentially dangerous bothered her, but the need for answers was stronger. The camera was working perfectly, and all she had to do now was wait. The days that followed were marked by growing tension. Lana knew the device was there, silently watching every movement in the hallway. And at the same time, she wondered what she would do if she really discovered something disturbing. How would she react? What would be the consequences of her curiosity? But at the same time, the idea of backing out seemed impossible. She had already come too far to give up. Lana began to dedicate a large part of her nights to monitoring the images transmitted by the camera. Sitting on the sofa, with her eyes fixed on the screen, she watched the empty hallway, feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering a secret about to be revealed. What had once been suspicions was now turning into an almost obsessive surveillance. She could barely concentrate on other things, her mind constantly returning to that hallway, that door, the man who hid behind it. The first nights of surveillance were a mix of expectation and frustration for Lana. Sitting on the sofa, with the monitor in front of her, she watched the images transmitted by the camera with almost hypnotic attention. The hallway, usually deserted, seemed even quieter and more harmless through the lens. No matter how much she hoped for some suspicious movement, the hours passed with nothing happening. The only thing that broke the monotony was the sporadic appearance of other residents, who quickly passed through the hallway without suspecting anything. Despite the lack of action, Lana couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She reviewed the recordings of the previous nights, looking for any detail that might have gone unnoticed. But the camera, no matter how much she wanted it to reveal some secret, only showed the banal reality of an ordinary building hallway. The doors remained closed, the silence was absolute, and Mr. Thompson's figure did not appear in any of the footage. This made her uneasy, but also determined to continue. With each passing day, Lana's frustration grew. She was waiting for an answer, a sign, but all she got was more questions. Why was nothing happening? What was Mr. Thompson doing during those nights when the noises had woken her up? The lack of answers only increased the mystery, making it even more unbearable. She began to question if she had made a mistake, if perhaps she was chasing ghosts where there was nothing concrete. Even with constant disappointment, Lana couldn't pull herself away from the screen. The monitor became her window into a secret world that she believed existed, even though she still had no proof. Each night was a new chance, and each morning brought with it the hope that finally, something would be revealed. The building, with its oppressive silence, seemed to mock her, offering only a calmness that contrasted with the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. During the hours when she wasn't watching the monitor, Lana found herself thinking about Mr. Thompson, more than she would like to admit. What did he do during the day? Why didn't he appear in the recordings? Was he really so reserved, or was he simply playing with her curiosity? The mystery surrounding that man made everything even harder to bear. Each day felt like a missed opportunity, and Lana began to doubt whether she could sustain that vigil for much longer without losing her sanity. And then, on one of those nights, while Lana watched the monotonous images of the hallway, something changed. It wasn't a sound, nor a sudden movement, but a feeling that the wait was about to end. The air seemed charged with electricity, as if the entire building was on the verge of revealing a long-guarded secret. It was a night like many others, and Lana was about to give up and go to bed when something on the monitor caught her attention. The image was calm, the hallway bathed in its usual darkness, except for a faint light coming from the floor below. Then, suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the screen. Lana leaned forward, her eyes wide open, her heart starting to race. The figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mr. Thompson. But this time, something was different. He moved with restrained urgency, almost as if he was fighting his own instinct to run. But what really made Lana's heart race was what he was carrying in his arms. Through the camera lens, she could clearly see a bulky figure, completely covered by a white sheet. The undefined shape and the way Mr. Thompson was holding it, with such effort and care, immediately set off an alarm in Lana. What could be so heavy, so urgent, that he needed to transport it at that hour of the night? Lana's eyes were fixed on the screen, every muscle in her body tense, as she watched Mr. Thompson walk to his apartment door. He seemed extremely focused, almost obsessive in his movements. The sheet covering the object, or whatever it was, hung irregularly, creating folds that left room for all sorts of speculations. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the muffled sound of his footsteps, and Lana's quickened breathing as she tried to control the torrent of thoughts that began to take over her mind. Mr. Thompson paused for a moment, as if he was listening for something, and Lana held her breath. She could feel the tension almost palpable through the screen. He looked around, his eyes scanning the empty hallway as if searching for something, or someone, who wasn't supposed to be there. For a brief second, Lana felt that he was about to discover the camera, that their eyes would somehow meet in an impossible way. But then, he turned his attention back to the door, slowly pushing it open with his shoulder, trying not to make any noise. What happened next was quick but unforgettable. Mr. Thompson disappeared for a moment inside the apartment, only to emerge again, still carrying the object covered by the sheet, but now moving back down the hallway. The camera followed him to the end of the corridor, where he turned right and disappeared from view. Lana jumped up, almost knocking over the monitor in the process, her heart beating frantically in her chest. What she had just witnessed made no sense at all, and that terrified her more than anything. That moment, that simple act of carrying something covered by a sheet in the middle of the night, opened Pandora's box in Lana's mind. She sat back on the sofa, her hands trembling as she tried to control the avalanche of thoughts. What exactly was Mr. Thompson doing? Why at that hour? And above all, what was under that sheet? The questions multiplied, each more disturbing than the last, and Lana knew she wouldn't rest until she understood what was happening. Lana watched the recording repeatedly, trying to catch some detail that might have gone unnoticed. But the scene was always the same, and the strangeness of the situation did not diminish. The way Mr. Thompson moved his body, the way his eyes always seemed alert as if expecting to be discovered at any moment. Everything contributed to the atmosphere of tension that now dominated Lana's mind. She could hardly think of anything else, her life suddenly reduced to that enigmatic scene. After that night, Lana's mind turned into a whirlwind of dark thoughts. What was once just an uneasy curiosity now became a potential nightmare. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Thompson carrying that figure covered by the sheet, and her imagination began to create the most disturbing scenarios. Could it be possible that he was involved in something terrible? A crime, perhaps? The idea seemed absurd, but with each passing hour, the doubts took deeper root in her mind. Lana began to isolate herself, immersed in her own speculations. All the normality of her life seemed to have evaporated, replaced by growing paranoia. She avoided the neighbors, fearing that any interaction could reveal something she preferred to keep hidden. And what if Mr. Thompson had seen her? What if he knew he was being watched? With each new hypothesis, Lana's heart beat faster, as if she were always on the edge of a cliff. Lana couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger. Mr. Thompson was no longer just a reclusive neighbor. In her mind, he had transformed into a threatening figure, capable of anything to protect his secrets. Every casual encounter in the hallway became a test of her sanity. His cold, calculating gaze, always avoiding eye contact, now seemed to hide dark intentions. She found herself even avoiding leaving the house, fearing that an encounter with him might lead to a confrontation she wasn't prepared to face. The nights once filled with the hope of discovering something were now haunted by the worst scenarios her mind could conceive. Lana wondered if she had made a mistake by installing the camera, if perhaps it would have been better never to get involved in the story. But it was too late to back out. What she had seen could not be undone, and the need to understand what was really happening was mixed with the fear of what she might find. Sleep, once peaceful, became a battle. Every dream was a distorted variation of the scene she had witnessed. The sheet, Mr. Thompson, the darkness of the hallway, everything came back to haunt her, night after night. In her most desperate hours, Lana wondered if she was going crazy, if her mind was playing cruel tricks on her. But logic, as much as she tried to cling to it, was always overridden by the growing terror that something terrible was about to be discovered. Determined to understand what was really happening, Lana threw herself headlong into her own investigation. She spent hours reviewing the recording from that night, as if every pixel could reveal a hidden clue. The movement of Mr. Thompson, the way he carried the object, every detail was analyzed with obsessive precision. With each new review, she looked for something she might have missed. A reflection, a shadow, anything that could give a clue about what was hidden under that sheet. During the day, Lana doubled her vigilance. She listened intently for any sound coming from upstairs, every movement that might indicate that Mr. Thompson was repeating his mysterious activities. The tension kept her in a constant state of alert, as if at any moment she might discover the final piece of the puzzle. Every noise, no matter how insignificant, seemed to carry with it a secret waiting to be unraveled. Lana also began to observe Mr. Thompson with even more attention. Whenever he left his apartment, she discreetly positioned herself in a corner, trying to catch any sign that he was hiding something. She noticed that he seemed more tense than usual, his shoulders always raised, his gaze furtive, as if he were constantly waiting to be caught in the act. But what bothered her the most was the silence. None of the other neighbors seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary, as if she were the only one perceiving the aura of mystery that surrounded that man. Lana's obsession began to affect her daily routine. She avoided leaving the house, afraid of missing a crucial moment. The nights were dedicated to revisiting the recording, but now also included long hours in front of the screen, waiting for any movement in the hallway. Minutes turned into hours, and she found herself skipping meals, unable to pull away from her vigil. Her life had become a constant dance between fear and the need to know the truth. In the midst of this solitary investigation, Lana began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Mr. Thompson looked around when entering or leaving the house, as if he were always aware that someone might be watching. The slight tremor in his hands when he held the key to open the door. These small, subtle signs only increased the certainty that he was hiding something of great importance, something he didn't want anyone else to know. Lana watched the video for the 1,000th time, her eyes exhausted but still determined. Each time she returned to that moment, she felt that something was on the verge of being revealed, as if the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. And then, in an almost imperceptible pause, she noticed it. A piece of the sheet covering the heavy object had slipped slightly, revealing a dark, polished edge. Wood. Lana felt her heart skip a beat. The image that had so disturbed her suddenly began to make sense, but not in the way she had imagined. With a chill down her spine, Lana zoomed in on the image and focused on that small exposed part. The texture of the wood, the shine that reflected the faint light from the hallway. It wasn't a body. nor something sinister as she had feared. It was a box, large and old, the kind of box people use to store precious memories. Or perhaps something even more personal. Lana realized that what she was seeing could be a miniature coffin, something that made her stomach turn with anguish and fear. The shock of the discovery hit Lana like a blow. All the assumptions she had made about Mr. Thompson crumbled in an instant. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't hiding a dark secret of past crimes. He was, in fact, dealing with something deeply personal, something that required an emotional strength she couldn't even imagine. That wooden box covered by a sheet was the center of the mystery, and now, Lana began to realize that the truth behind it was much more painful than any scenario her creative mind could have invented. Lana felt a wave of guilt spread through her body. How had she been so quick to judge? Mr. Thompson, who always seemed so distant and reserved, now revealed himself to her eyes as a tragic figure, someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. The realization that she had spied on such an intimate, pain-laden moment left her stunned. She wanted to close the monitor, erase the recordings, but she knew she couldn't, not after having come this far. Lana's mind began to piece together a puzzle that had previously seemed indecipherable. Mr. Thompson was alone, carrying that emotional weight without sharing it with anyone. Perhaps it was grief, a loss he couldn't overcome. The image of him, walking through the hallway in the middle of the night, carrying the box as if it were the most precious thing in the world, made her see a side of him she had never considered. It wasn't fear or guilt that moved him, but a deep, solitary sadness. Instead of the relief she expected to feel upon solving the mystery, Lana was overwhelmed by a crushing empathy. She imagined herself in his position, trying to deal with such great pain in silence, without being able or wanting to ask for help. Mr. Thompson, once an enigmatic stranger, was now a wounded soul, struggling against a pain that no one should face alone. Lana realized that the real threat wasn't what she feared he might do, but what he was already suffering. Gradually, Lana began to piece together the puzzle of Mr. Thompson's life through casual conversations with the neighbors. She discovered that he had lost his wife a few years ago, a woman he rarely spoke of, but whose absence seemed to have devastated his life. Mrs. Henderson, the downstairs neighbor, vaguely mentioned that the couple never had children, but that during their years of marriage, Mr. Thompson's wife used to organize small gatherings for the neighbors, bringing a little light to that seemingly solitary existence. Lana began to understand that Mr. Thompson's loneliness wasn't a choice, but a consequence of a devastating loss. The house he now lived in alone, once a vibrant, full-of-life home, had become a mausoleum of memories. The mysterious object he carried so carefully under the sheet now seemed to be a relic from a past he couldn't let go of. Every time he touched that object, it was as if he were trying to keep alive a part of himself that had been ripped away. The information Lana gathered began to paint a clear picture of a life marked by pain. From what she could gather, Mr. Thompson's wife was a lively woman who brought color to the world around her. But when she passed away, Mr. Thompson withdrew from social interaction, closing himself off in a hard, impenetrable shell. As the days went by, Lana found herself thinking about Mr. Thompson more and more. She remembered how he ignored her in the hallway, how he avoided any contact, and now she understood that it was coldness or disdain but a form of self-preservation. He was trying to survive each day without succumbing to the pain, and loneliness was his only companion. The realization of the silent struggle he fought daily brought tears to Lana's eyes, who found herself torn between guilt and compassion. One day, while Lana was at the local market, she heard Mrs. Henderson talking to another neighbor about how Mr. Thompson used to walk with his wife in the park every Sunday. It was a ritual they never broke, even on the coldest days. That image of a man in love devoted to his partner contrasted sharply with the specter Lana now saw. The sadness he carried was like a persistent shadow, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. These discoveries changed the way Lana saw the world around her. She began to notice loneliness in small things, in the way Mr. Thompson returned home every day at the same time, always carrying the same shopping bag, in the silence that filled the building after his entry. and in the absence of any trace of a social life. His pain, once invisible, was now almost tangible, and Lana began to understand that behind the walls of each apartment were stories no one could imagine, entire lives full of joys and sorrows, hidden in the daily routine. As Lana reflected on everything she had discovered about Mr. Thompson, a feeling of shame began to grow within her. Her initial suspicions, so filled with distrust and fear, now seemed almost childish in the light of the truth. What had once been an unsettling curiosity had turned into a rushed judgment based on stereotypes and prejudices she barely recognized in herself. Realizing how wrong she had been made her question her own attitudes and the way she viewed the world around her. Lana had always considered herself a fair person, giving people the benefit of the doubt. But faced with the mystery of Mr. Thompson, she realized that she had allowed her insecurities and fears to cloud her judgment. This revelation brought with it a need for introspection. Lana began to think about how first impressions can be deceiving, how the unknown often leads us to imagine the worst, instead of opening us up to empathy. This moment of reflection led Lana to realize something more about herself. She had always prided herself on being independent and strong, but the obsessive investigation into Mr. Thompson revealed a vulnerability she was not willing to admit. The fear of the unknown, the desire to control the environment around her, and even the search for answers in a situation that made her feel powerless. All of this was tied to a deeper insecurity. Recognizing this left her uncomfortable, but also opened her eyes to the complexity of human nature, both hers and others. The moral dilemma that now weighed on Lana was almost unbearable. After everything she had discovered about Mr. Thompson, she felt an almost visceral need to do something, to reach out and offer some kind of comfort. However, at the same time, she knew that confronting him could further violate his privacy, a line she had already crossed by installing the camera. She found herself torn between the desire to help and the fear of inflicting even more pain on a man who was already carrying so much suffering. Lana spent hours thinking about how she could approach the situation. She knew that any wrong move could be devastating, not just for Mr. Thompson, but also for her. What if he misunderstood her intentions? What if his reaction was pure hostility? After all, he had every right to keep his pain secret. But on the other hand, the idea of continuing to ignore what she knew seemed unbearable. She had seen a side of his life that no one else knew, and that created a responsibility she couldn't simply brush aside. Each day the dilemma became more complex. Mr. Thompson continued his silent routine, and every time Lana saw him, the weight of her decision became more evident. She knew he suspected nothing, that to him she was just another distant neighbor. This in itself should have been a relief, but instead, it made Lana feel even more guilty. She wanted to believe that what she was doing was for his own good, but the line between helping and invading was too thin to ignore. After sleepless nights and days of uncertainty, Lana finally made a decision. She knew she couldn't continue on the sidelines, watching from afar while Mr. Thompson sank into his pain. A surge of courage took over her, and on a cold gray afternoon she found herself knocking on his apartment door. The sound echoed down the hallway, her heart beating so hard she feared he might hear it from the other side. For a moment, she thought of turning back, but the door opened before she could reconsider. Mr. Thompson appeared in the doorway, his expression tired and surprised to see her there. Lana forced a smile, trying to disguise her nervousness. "Hi, Mr. Thompson. I'm Lana, your downstairs neighbor. I just wanted to know if you're okay." The sentence came out more hesitant than she intended, but there was no turning back. He looked at her for a moment that seemed to last forever, his eyes filled with deep sadness. Then, something unexpected happened. He gave a slight nod and, in silence, opened the door wider, inviting her in. The apartment was as gloomy as she had imagined. The heavy curtains blocked almost all daylight, and the atmosphere had a sense of stagnation, as if time had stopped in there. Lana sat in an old armchair, watching as Mr. Thompson settled in front of her. The silence that followed was heavy, full of unspoken things, but there was a softness in his gesture, as if, despite everything, he was relieved to have company. "I don't get many visitors," He began, his voice hoarse and low. Most people prefer to keep their distance. And I prefer it that way too. Lana didn't know exactly what to say, so she opted for sincerity. I imagine it must be difficult living here alone. The words floated in the air between them, and Mr. Thompson lowered his head, his shoulders tense as if carrying an immense weight. Yes, he replied, after a long sigh. It is difficult. Yes. The silence fell again, but then this time it seemed less oppressive. Lana felt she had opened a small breach, an opportunity to truly connect with him. I didn't mean to be intrusive, she continued, but I noticed that you carry something very heavy. He raised his gaze to her, and for a moment Lana saw in his eyes a vulnerability that touched her deeply. Yes, he murmured, almost to himself, very heavy. Lana's words seemed to open a door within Mr. Thompson, and he began to speak, hesitantly at first, but then with an intensity that surprised her. He spoke about his wife, about how she was the light of his life, and how everything darkened after her death. Every word was laden with emotion, and Lana felt her heart tighten as she listened to the depth of love and loss he had experienced. She realized that the object he carried was not just a box. It was a connection to the past, something he was not ready to let go of. As he spoke, Lana found herself sharing a bit of her own story, about her own losses and fears. The conversation flowed naturally, as if both were relieved to finally have someone with whom to share their pain. They understood each other on a level that went beyond words, and in that moment, the barriers that existed between them began to dissolve. Lana saw in him not just a neighbor, but a kindred spirit in suffering, someone who, like her, was trying to find a way to move forward. When the conversation finally began to wane, there was a sense of relief in the air. Mr. Thompson seemed lighter, as if talking about his pain had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Lana, in turn, felt more connected to him than she could have ever imagined. As she stood up to leave, she cast one last look at the man before her, now so human and vulnerable. "If you need anything at all, please let me know," she said. And for the first time, she saw a small smile on his lips. "I appreciate it, Lana. Truly, I appreciate it." After that unexpected conversation, something changed within Lana. The image she had of Mr. Thompson transformed completely, and with it grew a deep and genuine empathy. She began to realize that the lonely, reserved man who once seemed enigmatic and even threatening was, in fact, someone deeply marked by pain. Now every time she saw him, whether in the hallway or through the window, she no longer saw an aura of mystery, but rather a sadness that he carried with silent dignity. Lana began to notice details that had previously escaped her. The way he, early in the morning, watered the plants on the windowsill, the only bright colors in such a dark apartment. The careful way he folded the newspaper before putting it in his bag, as if each movement were an attempt to maintain some control amidst the internal chaos. These gestures, small and seemingly insignificant, now revealed a humanity that touched her deeply. She felt a new connection with him, as if, by understanding his pain, she could share a little of the burden he carried. Lana's empathy grew with each passing day. She no longer saw Mr. Thompson just as a strange neighbor, but as someone who, like her, was navigating the turbulent waters of life, trying to find balance. This new perspective also made Lana reflect on the nature of pain and grief. She realized that each person deals with loss in a unique way, and that there is no right or wrong path to follow. The relationship between them, although not frequently verbalized, became a silent dance of mutual recognition and respect. Lana knew that she didn't need words to express what she felt. The simple fact of being present, of showing that he was not completely alone, was enough. The experience with Mr. Thompson changed Lana in ways she could never have predicted. What began as a curiosity turned into a deep journey of self-discovery. Before, Lana saw the world in simple terms, dividing people into easy-to-understand categories. But witnessing her neighbor's silent pain and grief made her realize that life and the people who live it are much more complex than they appear to be. Her simplistic assumptions fell apart, giving way to a deeper and more empathetic understanding of the human condition. Lana began to look at her own life with new eyes. The small daily frustrations that once seemed so big now seemed trivial compared to the internal struggles that people around her might be facing. She found herself reflecting on the times she had judged others based on appearances or superficial behaviors, without ever considering the invisible battles they might be fighting. This new perspective made her more aware of her words and actions, recognizing the impact they could have on the lives of others. This transformation did not come without discomfort. Lana realized that to truly embrace this new way of seeing the world, she would have to confront parts of herself she preferred to ignore. The fear of the unknown, the need to control and understand everything around her, and even the tendency to avoid situations that made her feel vulnerable. Mr. Thompson, without saying a word, had exposed these weaknesses in Lana, forcing her to confront her own hasty judgments and lack of empathy. Instead of resenting these revelations, Lana embraced them. She realized that her experience with Mr. Thompson was a rare opportunity for personal growth. The empathy she developed for him extended to other aspects of her life, affecting her interactions with friends, family, and even strangers. She became more patient, more willing to listen and understand, instead of jumping to conclusions. Every encounter became an opportunity to practice this new understanding, to see beyond appearances, and to value the complexity of each individual. This change also brought a new serenity to Lana's life. By accepting that not everything can be understood or controlled, she began to feel more at peace with herself. What used to worry or cause anxiety now seemed less threatening, as she understood that life was full of uncertainties, and it was okay not to have all the answers. Lana learned to trust her intuition more, to value human connections, and to recognize that often what people need is not solutions, but presence and understanding. Looking back, Lana realized that the true lesson wasn't just in understanding Mr. Thompson, but in understanding herself through him. The barriers that once existed between her and the world around her began to disappear, replaced by a genuine desire to connect with people on a deeper level. She no longer needed quick answers or easy judgments. Now, she was more interested in the stories each person carried, in the mysteries each life hid. Lana's transformation was also reflected in her daily choices. She became more open to experiences, more willing to explore the unknown, whether in her personal relationships or in new opportunities that had previously intimidated her. Each day was a chance to practice the empathy she had learned from Mr. Thompson, to be a positive presence in the lives of others, and to continue growing as a person. The pain she once feared was now seen as an inevitable and even necessary part of the human experience, something that united people rather than separating them. Lana knew that her journey was far from over. Life, with all its complexities and twists, would continue to challenge and teach her. But now, she was ready to face these challenges with a more open heart and a more understanding mind. What Mr. Thompson had shown her was more than a story of pain. It was a life lesson on the importance of seeing beyond appearances and valuing the humanity in each person who crossed her path. And that, Lana thought, was the most powerful transformation of all. If you enjoyed Lana's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. If you love Emotional Chronicles and want to support our channel to keep bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting chronicle.